Fabulous. Well, thank you everybody for your great talks, and I'm sure we've all got lots of questions. First off, Nick, if I might ask you, are all tastes created equal, or are there some that are a bit more different than others?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, but I know where this is coming from. So I think that sweet, umami and bitter are in many ways closely related. Salty taste is very complicated. I'm not going to go into it. But in actual fact, we understand probably least about sour. So for the other tastes, we actually know what the receptors are. And for sour, we still don't know what the receptor is. The taste system clearly responds to acids. We measure nerve responses, big nerve responses to acids. But if we actually kill the cells that are responsible for sour taste, animals still reject sour stimuli, just as they would do if they had taste. And in fact, over the years, we've found that a number of other things that are not acids activate the sour taste cells. So sparkling water, for example, activates the sour taste cells just as well as acids. In fact, high concentrations of salt also activate the sour taste cells. Neither sparkling water nor high concentrations of salt would be described by anybody as sour. And so I think that really what I'm trying to say is that sour taste is probably a combination of different sensory inputs, not just taste, but also basically input through the touch system, through the trigeminal nerve, and possibly through other things.
So there's really a lot going on there.
Yes, really complicated, and it's not just taste.
Right, great. Anybody else got any comments on the sour taste? Catherine, since we have you here, can we use some of the tricks you talked about with all the senses and memories and emotions? Can we use these tricks to try and help people eat a bit healthier?
Well, that would be desirable, and I hope that we will say that for sure in a couple of years. So, I mean, we are still in the very early steps or in the infancy of that type of research. So there's a lot of consumer studies that I have mentioned mostly, so we see those behavioral effects, but we don't understand the mechanisms fully yet. So until we do that, until we really know what's happening in the brains, it will be very difficult to use those methods systematically. And what also has not done at all, at least to my knowledge, is to see whether there are any long-term effects. Because just changing a perception or a liking for the moment, that's neat, but what would be necessary is to really change it in the long run. And this is where most nutritional interventions and like changes in eating behavior have really struggled so far. So my bet would be it's not that easy.
So it's not just a case of colouring broccoli a nice appetitive pink colour or something like that?
Well, I guess for like individual foods, that's going to work, right? So if you like sell a broccoli to your child for whichever strategy you want to use, that's going to work for broccoli. But whether that generalizes to other vegetables that are also bitter, well, that is unclear. So I think it will require quite some work.
So it's a combination of a lot of things, as we're finding out.
It is.
And Julie, I mean, this very much speaks to what you were saying about how we get children to eat healthier as well, and why there's no broccoli epidemic. Then, sorry to focus on broccoli so much, but have you got any sort of insights into how we might stimulate this healthier pattern?
Well, I think just focusing on the child isn't going to be the answer, because food is a social event that defines a family. But I think there is greater plasticity in the child. And so what you can see through experimental studies is repeated exposure. If they get the taste of the food 8 to 10 times, they'll eat more of it. It takes longer for the face to change. But you can see that through and with experience with variety, they will be more accepting of new foods or novel vegetables or fruits. And that's a pretty international body of research on infants that has been, when you look at the convergence of findings they're showing. So that it may be that it's more difficult in the adult because you don't have as much plasticity and you have a lot more expectations, as Catherine had said, where the child is really open to this learning.
And it seems as well that children, correct me if I'm wrong, but they have a very sort of pure relationship with flavour. They're not yet influenced like we are by, this need to eat healthy or organic or to watch their calories. It is purely about what they put in their mouth.
Taste is the one can look, don't just focus on food, focus on medicines and compliance issues. We're there because children aren't able to swallow pills which encapsulate the bad taste. They take the medicine in a liquid form. The number one reason for non-compliance with medications is taste in children. And in some cases, that's life-threatening.
Well, moving on then, John, so we've talked quite a lot about umami and about MSG, and this, as was hinted earlier, is one of the biggest food myths around. So do you have any theories about why it's been so persistent?
Don't really have a good explanation, but I think one can look at it in a number of ways. One is that we all like narrative. We like stories. And what is the essence of a good story? One essence is conspiracy. Another essence is death. And in a way, the MSG story locks into those because danger, death is a good, if you're going to tell a thriller, to have a bit of death in it is quite good. If you're going to tell a thriller, having a bit of conspiracy, that the food industry is trying to make something that is dangerous but covering it up. So it got those elements of narrative that are quite difficult to dislodge. So in a sense, you're pushing porridge uphill when you're trying to dislodge the story. Add to that the well-known psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias, which is, I always thought it was a bit dodgy, and now somebody said that it is. Oh yeah, that confirms what I thought, and that's also very difficult to overcome. So I think what we're doing here with MSG, the same is true of GMOs, at least in this country, not in the United States, where people are a bit more sensible. But it's lodged in people's minds that there's something dangerous here, and that Monsanto is trying to cover it all up and pretend that it's all fine. Probably the regulator, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, has been captured by the industry anyway, fits with the conspiracy theory. And I think it's one of those. And when I think of the analogy with GM, I remember once when the US Agriculture Secretary was a man called Dan Glickman. He came over to London, and I met him at the US Embassy, and he said, John, I can't understand why it is that you Brits won't eat GMOs, because folks over in the States are scoffing them every day and quite happy. And I said, well, the problem is this, that GMOs were presented to us primarily as a benefit to the producer, not the consumer. So if only you could turn the story around and say, this is better for you, or healthier, or more nutritious, or safer, that might change the discourse. And he said, I see what you mean, John. Excuse the American accent. He said, what you're looking for is a tomato with the Viagra gene. So I think if one presents the MSG story not as MSG is safe after all, but approaches it from a different angle, talks about deliciousness, nutrition benefits, healthy eating benefits, and folds the MSG story into that, that might be the angle of changing public perception. But I don't think it's going to be helpful to say, you're all wrong, it was perfectly safe all along, this was some phony scientist back in the 1970s, because the answer is, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? That just confirms what I thought. There's a conspiracy here, and Ajinomoto is now trying even more conspiracy to hush it all up. So I think it's got to be approached from a different angle.
If I may chime in, I find it interesting because I think during the late 80s, 90s, there was this whole anti-MSG movement in the US, and driven by some of these books that claimed MSG was the cause of everything. But we were actually accused of controlling the FDA then. So, we wish, but you know, it doesn't work that way. So.
It's amazing how much power is often given over in these sorts of stories, isn't it? And I'm also sad to hear that, unfortunately, just facts and evidence aren't always enough, that we need to change the story in other ways to try and put...
I mean, that's a sad thing for a scientist to admit. And, you know, my instinct is to say, but look, here's the evidence. But I don't think that really, unless you can fold the evidence into a narrative, it won't gain traction.
Well, I think that's where people like me, science journalists, communicators come in, because we're the ones who often control that narrative.
Yes.
And perhaps if we can be a bit more weaving the evidence in and telling a different story.
Yes, it's not about distorting the evidence, but it's about framing it in a different way.
Right.
And I think as scientists, you're always focusing on what you don't know, because each discovery it has probably 10
That's what
more
keeps
questions.
us in business.
Yeah. But when one looks at food trends, I find it interesting that probably one of the biggest food trends is going to be foods that are hydrolyzed protein based, whether it's in sports, infant formula, the sports and nutrition is the projection, and those are basically what we're eating is free amino acids. Whether it's for these slimming foods, for diet foods, that's where there's going to be a lot of growth. I just find that kind of interesting.
And so, but you know, basically by inference, you know, those products will have very high glutamate levels because, you know, glutamate is one of the most abundant amino acids in protein. And in fact, you know, the infant, I talked about how much infants get through mother's milk of glutamate, but if you take the hydrolyzed formula, for instance, they get about 10 times that. So, you know, there's plenty of glutamate around, but as I said, if the name's different, then people don't care too much about it. So.
Could I just, I wondered if, you know, given that Catherine's working on behavior change and how you frame the presentation of foods in a way to influence people's choices, whether there are some insights from your research on what it is that attracts people to a particular food that would be of relevance to understanding how to recast the story about MSG?
So unfortunately, there's no simple answer to that question because it very much depends on individual motives. For example, when you think of a low-fat or zero-fat label on a product, so if you are probably, let's say, a young woman on a diet attempting to lose weight, you may be very much attracted by that label and enjoy that product a lot. While when you couldn't care less about your weight and you're all about creaminess and pleasure, you would not get yourself to buy that product. And even if somebody forces you to eat it, you would find it displeasing just because of that label, which does not fit with your motivation at the moment. So that makes labeling products actually very difficult. And when we look at the salt label data that I just presented, labeling things low salt, for example, is very common because a lot of people need a low sodium diet nowadays. But it may actually lead to reduced acceptance because people experience it as tasting stale, and then in turn actually using other products or even adding salt by themselves to counter this percept, which is just an illusion, so to say. So it's not that easy. And I'm sure Julie can tell stories if you talk to children about the health benefits of vegetables. I mean, that's a no-go, right? They're not going to eat them just because they're healthy. They need to be fun and enjoyable, while an adult may respond to this health argument quite well.
Right. And of course, the difficulty is that, sweet and salt and fat taste nice, and we are very drawn to those. And do you think there's a place, Takeshi, for umami, for this delicious savouriness to be a good message for health?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there are some Japanese scientists who are studying that there might be a competition between umami and fat taste, for instance, in that the more umami you have, the less fat you crave or need, I think. But I think that's probably a learned thing, so you probably have to start early in terms of this type of taste education, or educating your taste buds, perhaps.
Mm. And when it comes to umami, Daisuke, are there many differences in the umami flavours that you have in Japan and that you found in Britain?
Yes. The reason Japanese cuisine said that it is liquid cuisine, because we are using a lot liquid like a dashi stock, and then European cuisine making not liquid umami, like how to say, dried tomato, dried mushroom, and aged beef, aged cheese, not liquid. This is different for me. Yeah.
So our umami flavours are more in the individual ingredients.
Yeah. Yes.
Whereas in Japan,
For
they're
Japan,
sort of
making
infused
yes.
into the background.
Yes.
I see. And do they taste different? I mean, the stock that you produced earlier was very different from Marmite.
Yes.
Have you found a lot of differences in the palates?
Different palette, but same umami.
Same umami.
Different technique.
I see. Great. Well, I think if we have any questions from the audience now, right in there. Yes. Is there a microphone? Here we go. Come up. Please introduce yourself and give your question.
Laura Santini, taste number 5 umami. I've got 2 questions, if I may. First, I'm interested in the idea of emotional nutrition. So my first question is to Takeshi-san. And then my follow-up question is to Julie about pain and sugar, and wondering if emotional pain, I'm not a scientist, is that also made to feel better by sugar? Those are my 2 questions.
Okay, so at the moment we have some, shall we say, consumer-type research looking at what are the taste characteristics that people like. So we can map them out, basically, and see what characteristics in the taste sphere that they like. But by extension, we could probably extend that to include psychological feelings or benefits and so on. And so immediate future, we're trying to incorporate that aspect of, what is liking. I think there's liking, but also there's the feeling of satisfied, deliciousness, shall we say, which gives you emotional quality, is what we feel. I think because, for instance, if you've had a really good meal and so on, it's not just, oh, it tasted good. You had this more pleasure or, more, shall we say, psychological satisfaction. And we want to sort of, shall we say, map out those elements as well to see what are the parameters that are necessary to fulfill that. So it may not just be the taste elements, it might be to do with ambiance and other eating partners and so on as well. But I think we'd like to really find out that aspect as well, so that better quality of enjoyment can be incorporated in the meals.
So when it comes to the work on pain and sweet taste, It works for like needle. It doesn't work as good for needle-induced pain as for other types, but it's now standard of care in many hospital nurseries during heel prick procedures or circumcision. One of the things that we keep on seeing it's almost like the children are telling us is that when you look at the obese child and the normal weight child, they all prefer higher levels of sweet. It's not, there's a myth that maybe the obese child prefers higher levels. They don't. But where they're different is sweets don't work as good as an analgesic. So to those children, whether if it's some blunted system, are they eating more to get the same effect? But you can look at the motivation for eating and the motivation for the children have. And sweets seem to be, for some children, seem to be blunting different types of whether emotional pain is in there, is some suggestion of it. So I think that, you know, the general prescription of get rid of sweets may be doing something for some children. They're enabling them to cope in ways that we don't understand. How we can then, I think we have to understand how we can help them feel better without having to eat the sweets. So it's complicated, but it's not just a source of calories. It's not just because it tastes good. It makes them feel good too.
Okay, and Barry?
I wonder if I could have two questions too. One first to Julie, just to say, given the vulnerability that we have to sugar, what's the story about why we're so vulnerable to things we don't find in nature but companies cook up? Salt, fat, and sugar combinations. People are always asking me why people like salted caramel, and you say, you know, salt, fat, and sugar. What's there to know? But that's not something that's necessarily found there. So why are they vulnerable to that?
I think they're vulnerable because the taste system that's detecting whether it's the salt in a mineral or the sweetness in a fruit or honey is the same detection system that's tasting the sweet in a manufactured sweet. The reality is in our countries, the children from the age of 2 are more likely to eat a manufactured sweet than a fruit, which that system was designed to detect on any given day. So the biology is the same. It's just that the food environment has changed. We are now manufacturing foods. They're cheap, they're abundant, and the reason they taste good is because we have this taste system that's detecting the saltiness and sweetness, whether it's coming from honey or a fruit or a manufactured sweet. The biology is the same.
Biology is the same. Thank you. And Catherine, hi, it's Barry Smith. I can't resist as my philosophical training to ask you, why do you say that flavor perception is subjective when actually what you're showing us is that it's variable by context, also that there are individual differences, and clever psychologists like you figure out what color associations we have with what foods, and all of that suggests not it's subjective, but it's complex. I mean, you said subjective because it happens in the brain, but look, your brain also guides you around the world and makes sure you don't bump into objects. The fact that it's perception in the brain doesn't stop you from getting a good take on the things in your environment. So do you have to talk that way? I think I could parse everything you were saying without that claim that neuroscientists can't resist saying it's all subjective. Selectivity, individual difference, not the same as subjectivity, surely.
I think we actually do agree on these definitions. So
cool.
Maybe I mixed two things together. So not only flavor perception, but perception in general is very subjective. That's what I wanted to also highlight with the letters and the wording. But at the same time, it also indicated that the context that may be very individual. So if I speak the English language, I perceive the letters differently than somebody who does not speak any English, for example. So that makes it subjective, but also influenced by context.
Doesn't make it subjective at all. It means that there's a very complicated cultural, historical reason why you give an objective story about people who've learned English getting that effect and people who've not been exposed to that letter not getting that effect. Subjective is if, as you wanted to say, we all have completely individual and different reactions to the flavors we're tasting. Look, if a banana tastes like an orange to you, there's either something wrong with you or the banana, right? So, but we don't have to go subjective on it.
But maybe it's just also a difference in definition. So I don't see it that categorical that subjective means like two completely different things. So they can be very, very similarly perceived. For example, in color vision, we see that what I perceive as blue, somebody else may actually label more violet or even reddish. So it does not mean that somebody else would say it's bright yellow. Maybe we can agree on that.
Yes, there's a risk of falling down a semantic rabbit hole here, isn't there? But I hope we're all agreed that there is variation and certainly fuzziness around the edges. Is that another question?
Hello, Lucy Chambers from the British Nutrition Foundation. So we've known for a while that taste preferences are the product of our experience, of our learning, and there's emerging evidence and quite compelling evidence now that there's also a genetic component to our taste preferences. I'm quite interested in those periods in our life, like Julie said, when children, for example, like sweet flavours. There's periods when people are pregnant and they go off certain flavours. So what's the mechanism that's influencing our sort of on-off, our sort of short-term changes in taste preferences that are related to our life stages?
So there's big change. I mean, there are big changes that are happening that unfortunately there's not a lot of good animal models, and that's the only way we're going to get at that, the answers to that. Why does the level of sweet and salt preference decline during adolescence? What's the metabolic signal that's we don't know. There's been one study that was done in the 80s that actually showed that adolescent rats also showed a decline in preferences for sweet. But that remains a mystery. And there's also evidence that for some bitters, childhood may represent a time of heightened bitter sensitivity. You know, does expression levels, how does experience, I mean, there's so many, when I look at the animal model studies, one could only dream of what are some of the mechanisms that underlie the effect of not just experience, but the context in which we experience it. But I have to say that if there was one great example that I often use, that it looks at the timing of eating a food and developing a cultural food preferences, it's Marmite and Vegemite. Because you see a cultural food that defines a people. You could look at people who have never experienced both and they reject both equally, but yet you could look at the preference for Marmite in the UK versus Vegemite in Australia, where it's really kind of fascinating how that cultural food habit, somebody had sent me a quote from somebody from the Midlands. If you don't get a kid to eat it by 2, they're never going to eat it. But you see the cultural eating in the morning when you're hungry, having it on, that it starts to define it such that when people leave, that's the one thing they want to get. You know, I often hear colleagues that, I didn't need it that much when I was home, but now you have it's calling you back. So it's almost magical. It's this, it's not just that you experienced it, it's timing, and that's the highlight of sensitive period, that you've experienced during a time in life that is a preference that's hard to break if you develop one. And it's a great example of that we witness it in cultures around the world and what we like. But that's a really strong one because you could have something that's very similar in taste, and you clearly will prefer Marmite to Vegemite. And I think it's a fascinating one, that there's that certain blend that has come to identify, just like a culture's food come to identify what that culture that's supposed to taste like.
Thank you. For the second question, Julie, for you, it's about this sensitive period when we acquire food preferences, which you said first 1,000 days is critical time for exposing children to foods and getting to learn to like healthy foods. What I'm interested in is sort of how much you can say about that sensitive period. Is it in the first sort of when foods are first introduced? Is that the very sensitive point, and then you become less?
It's hard.
able to learn about food?
We know a lot less about the chemical senses than vision or audition, where there's a lot more, beautiful work that really define the concept of sensitive periods, Eagle and Weasel. But if we can learn from other sensitive periods, there are probably multiple windows that the higher the cognitive functioning, the longer the window is going to stay open. It's sensitive. That doesn't mean that the window shuts. We're omnivores. We could all learn to like new foods. There's just something about that emotional potency that probably has to do, as Catherine said, with that emotional context in which you experience foods when you're young that just makes it, what the ingredients are, I don't know. But I think Marmite and Vegemite, there's a secret there to learn.
Just very quickly, the reason I asked that question is because in the UK recently, SACN, the Advisory Committee for Public Health England, reviewed our infant feeding guidelines, and they said there wasn't enough evidence for a sensitive period before 6 months of age to learn about flavours and food. And you agree with that position?
When it comes to foods, there hasn't been enough work. But you can see that the baby is open to learning.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that's the only time that they'll learn, or that it gets more difficult later.
Okay.
I mean, I think when you look at some of the studies that are coming out, and this is just relationship, a lot of the epidemiology, that pretty much what the child's eating about 2 and 2.5 years of age is the amount of variety that they have in their diet, that's pretty much tracking. And so that's not evidence of sensitive period, but it's evidence that you've got those first 1,000 days that are probably more important than we had previously thought they were.
Okay, thanks very much.
And would that be why certain foods tend only to be acquired by adults? I'm thinking back that I hated olives up until the age of something like 18, and then suddenly they tasted nice. Same with smelly cheese, as I was saying earlier.
I think your senses are changing. I mean, you've got bitter going down. I think college age is, to be honest, I think that's an age that has been neglected, that really we should focus on. Bitter and salt salt and sweet are going down. Bitter sensitivity is changing. But one of the main reasons why that's such an important time, because those are the future generation parents. And if you can tap into this changing food preference, and people often say, when my child went to college, they started eating better. Darwin noted it in his own children, how their sense of taste changed. And I think this is just an opportune time, whether they're motivated as well but it may be a good time to get these healthier eating habits, because if you can get that you've got the next generation of parents.
And this is about not just focusing on the child, but
it's never going to work.
Yes.
It's never going to be a sustainable behavior. If you feed, feed child, you can get them to love jarred carrots, but if that mother and father aren't eating carrots, that child's never going to eat carrots for several years. Think about it. You can't feed them alone. It doesn't make sense.
Indeed. And I'm curious, Daisuke, you grew up in Japan.
Yes.
Not with Marmite.
No, Marmite.
Did it take you a while to learn to like it, or do you still not really?
I don't like it. Sorry.
That's fair. That's honest. Takeshi, do you like Marmite?
I came to England when I was 15, and I was put in a boarding school where we used to have Marmite on, and toast and so on. So I like it actually.
So I'm a big Marmite fan, and I disagree. It tastes very different from Vegemite.
Exactly. No, that's exactly the case.
Yeah, definitely, very different. Question here, yes. No, further forwards. Further forwards. Yes. So I'll come to you next.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I'm Li Jinke from Food and Nutrition Science Center in Hangzhou, China. Because as a Chinese, so I'm going to ask something about a Chinese restaurant, the Chinese restaurant syndrome. And as I understood, many people had that kind of impression of really not very healthy food from Chinese restaurant. It's because after eating, we feel the mouth dryness. So I'm going to ask Dr. Kimura, and also the chef. And what is the reason the MSG? Because people believe Chinese restaurant is using too much MSG, and which causes the dryness in the mouth. What is the reason of that, biological reason? And also for the chef, Mr. Hayashi, do you have any trick to teach us how to cook food at home with adding the MSG, but you don't feel the mouth dry? And because we all know when we cooking at home, even with a seaweed soup, very tasty, but you don't have this mouth dry feeling afterwards. So, yeah, that's my question.
Well, I have to say that MSG is used in aged, actually, to increase salivation. So I find the mouth dryness story a little bit suspect, and it may be more to do with too much salt in the cooking, perhaps. And yeah, right. And regarding Chinese restaurant syndrome, for instance, we did a study in US. It's a multi-center study with Harvard Medical School, Northwestern, and UCLA. And we recruited people who believed that 100% they believed that they reacted to MSG. And basically we did trials with capsules as well as with meals and so on. And nobody basically gave a reproducible reaction, basically. So, I think a lot of it is, shall we say, there's belief. There are people who believe that they react to many things, but whether it's true, you have to do a proper study. And as I said, I don't think we've done a study on mouth dryness per se, but I know that it's not one of the symptoms of the so-called Chinese restaurant syndrome as was initially defined, but I think it's more to do with the salt intake, and as I said, glutamate itself has a more saliva secreting effect. So I think, as I said, I'm not very sure about whether that is really true. It's probably might be one of the Chinese myths, shall we say.
And chef, do you have recommendations?
Yes, home cooking and restaurant cooking is different. And we got money from customer. That's why I took more time or more, how to say, ingredient. But if you don't have time, you can use like a glutamate, Ajinomoto. Very quick, yes, no problem for me, yes.
I share the same experience with you. I don't really, I actually love MSG, no problem. So if I may ask another just following up question, because Dr. Kimura just say the MSG, the glutamine acid actually has the saliva secreting effects. I know that is the fact, but really afterwards, maybe later on, people does feel dryness. It's possible, maybe. Maybe it's the salt. So actually, this question is addressed to Dr. Raiba. Do you have any insight into this from the taste buds and also the taste receptor point of view? Is there any interaction between umami taste and saliva secreting?
So it's not something that. So this becomes a very human question in a way. We've not measured what happens in mice with saliva secretion. I'm sure there may be research, but we don't have any evidence that glutamate would cause salivation or would not cause salivation. So I really can't answer the question.
Thank you for your question. I believe there was one, yes, in the middle of the room.
Thanks. Hi. I find the term umami a little bit frustrating because it's so prone to misunderstanding. I think, because it's a Japanese word, people automatically assume that it's a uniquely Japanese thing, whereas it's actually universal, and B, because it's a foreign word, people have no way of grasping the meaning intuitively. There's no in for them. Because I hear when I talk about umami, people have all kinds of weird ideas about what it is. Like it's a quintessence of flavor, it's a universal flavor, it's a harmony of all flavors. Because people don't get the basicness of it. So I'm wondering, should we abandon the word and maybe replace it with something that is easier for people to understand? Or do we just have to keep banging on with this word until people get it?
Takeshi?
Well, I mentioned in my talk that during the early days there was discussion exactly on that point, that it's a Japanese word and can we not use an English word? And savory was the prime candidate. But we got a lot of opposition from the US researchers that basically, savory, the concept of savory in England, I guess, savory with a U maybe is the key, but I think, but as I said, there was no consensus there actually. So that's why we stuck with umami essentially. So I don't know, it might be too late in the day to change that perhaps, but at the moment we feel umami has become a fairly common word and well known, but maybe not as much as savory. But as I said, there is this issue with what savory means is rather different for different countries, and so that was the key problem.
And maybe this is something that Catherine, you could speak to, talking about labelling and the importance of words. How do you feel about umami?
Well, something we discover also with our participants is that most of them are not very familiar with the term. So it needs a little bit of explaining, and they need to try it, and and that unfortunately also leads to the fact that we exclude umami from most of our studies. Because when we want to compare, for example, the mechanisms of the different taste qualities, there's an imbalance because the other four, sweet, sour, salty, and bitter, are very familiar and everybody really knows what they mean. And umami just isn't, at least not in Germany, I'm afraid. So that needs some learning.
Well, it definitely eluded Aristotle, so there's no shame in not knowing it now either.
So one question, is there a German word that is close to umami, like savory, for instance?
There's a word like savory, which is in German herzhaft, and this is also what we use when we explain it.
And on the subject of the 5 basic tastes, or perhaps 6 or 7, Nick, maybe you could talk about, do you think there are other taste receptors yet to be found? Do we have more than basic 5 tastes?
Yes. So whether we have more than 5 basic tastes is, again, something I can't really answer since we work with mice. But as far as we can tell, mice don't have other tastes that they distinguish from the 5 basic tastes. Now, that doesn't mean to say that everything can be characterized as a simple taste. As I said earlier, salt is complicated. So low concentrations of sodium chloride stimulate one particular pathway. They work through an ion channel that's expressed in a particular population of taste receptor cells that don't respond to other tastes. But high concentrations of salt start to activate the bitter and, as I said earlier, the sour pathways, accounting for why high salt becomes aversive. And so, in some ways you could say that salt is a really complicated type of tastant, because at one level it does something specific, and at another level it does something much more general. But we don't find taste responses when we stimulate mouse taste buds with fat.
Yes, fat is the one that's often brought up as possibly being a 6th taste.
Yeah. But I mean, we don't find taste response is when we stimulate mouse taste buds with capsaicin, the hot ingredient from chili pepper. But I mean, obviously, everybody knows that it produces an oral reaction, and that oral reaction actually comes from pain fibers from a trigeminal nerve. And so, you know, just because you put it in your mouth, you call it taste. but chili pepper is clearly not taste.
It's more sensation.
Sensations, yeah. I mean, obviously, I think that there's a sensation of fat.
Yeah.
I think everybody appreciates there's a sensation of fat, but in mice, it's not carried by the taste pathways.
Right. I mean, it certainly feels good in the mouth, very unctuous.
Definitely, and it's probably more than just feel. It probably has olfactory input.
I mean, it seems logical, right? So we have the three major food groups. We have protein and carbohydrate and fat. We have taste receptors for two of them, the sweet and the umami. It feels like it ought to be there, but not in mice, at least.
Yes.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, please, at the front.
Thank you. Takashi from Japanese Embassy, promoting Japanese food here, based here. The number of vegetarians or even vegans are rapidly increasing in this country. So I have two questions. One is for Lord Krebs. If you believe this country is heading toward a better or healthier diet. And then the second question is for Mr. Kimura and Mr. Hayashi. Is there any idea that we can ride on this trend to promote umami taste?
Yeah, on vegetarianism or veganism, as I understand it, there is no evidence that government healthy eating campaigns, eat 5 a day, have had any effect. So people still eat probably around half the recommended amount per day of fruit and vegetables. What is happening, though, is that food manufacturers are reformulating food products to contain a better balance for the diet. And that's linked to the fact that probably much more in the UK than in Japan, I don't know about the US, there's a massive market for ready meals or processed food of one sort or another. And the initial reformulation was to do with salt. So back in 2001, SACM, the committee that was referred to earlier, Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, recommended that the target level of salt consumption should be about 6 grams per person per day. At that time, the consumption was between 9 and 10 grams, so way over the recommendation. Most of that salt is not what you add at the table or in cooking. It's already in bread, cookies, ready meals, pizzas, and so on. So there was a concerted campaign to get the food industry to lower the salt content of processed food, which was successful. And there are calculations that tens of thousands of strokes or heart attacks have been saved by the food industry's action. And the reason that happened was because it became a matter of competitive advantage to say our food is low salt. So Marks and Spencer's, one of the retailers, used to have a slogan in many of their stores: we're taking salt out of our food faster than you can say sodium chloride. So that was salt. But more recently, an organisation, a very small NGO in the UK called the Food Foundation, has been trying to encourage food manufacturers and retailers to increase the vegetable component of processed food and ready meals. And there already are shifts taking place, and I suspect that trend will take place. So it will continue. So I don't think there's a conscious shift by the consumer, apart from the relatively small proportion of people who are vegetarians or vegans.
Within the frozen food sector, probably the Asian type cuisine, including Japanese, Chinese, and so on, are the fastest growing. And because I think the Western style cuisine or frozen food is regarded as being less healthy and so on. But, we recently bought a company in France hoping to bring out certain Asian type products in Europe as well, but we haven't, we haven't really ventured into the British market yet. So hopefully we may be able to do that one day. Thank you.
This is a challenge for me. If I use butter, cream, oil, fat, very, very easy, but not healthy. How to say? Everyone has to know umami technique. That's why I'm here.
Thank you very much. Oh, I appear to be live still. Great. Are there any other questions? We have another one at the front here. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Ping Fan Rao with a Nature from partner journal, Science of Food.
Welcome.
I'm very curious about, very interested in listening all the interesting, great talks. Talk about taste is really something at the core of food science. And talking about this MSG thing, I have a question for Dr. Kimura. That we know that the salt, we have another story about vitamin E suddenly turn into mortamine, right? Vitamin in the food, it would be very beneficial to the health. But now you purified vitamin E and using the vitamin E, try to see the effect on the anti-cancer effect. Instead of anti-cancer, it promotes the cancer. That kind of question. Now, have we done anything like comparing the glutamic acid in the natural food system, even at a very high content, in comparison with like 99% of MSG? It's very much like salt, the same thing. And I know there's a salt produced in Okinawa. Instead of increase the blood pressure, it lowered the blood pressure because it's only sodium chloride, it's only 70%. The rest of the something means something. So far, we've been treating foods like chemicals. If we treat food as it is, like our biology, human biology get used to it, that this biology never used to the very high constant purified stuff. Have you done anything in comparison, the glutamic acid in the natural food system and the purified system?
Well, I think it also depends what you mean by natural. For instance, do you call yeast extracts or hydrolyzed vegetable proteins natural or not? And that's one question. So what do you sort of compare it with? Because if you take truly, for instance, if I was to do an experiment with Parmesan cheese, then, what will you be looking at? Because it's 1.5% glutamate. So how can you give a dose that's, say, 5% or more? You'd have to sort of, substitute all of the diet with Parmesan cheese, which doesn't work really. So there are sort of these methodological problems with running experiments. So I think at the moment, what we can do is, we haven't done it yet, but, compare the effects of low levels, say, equivalent to Parmesan cheese of MSG added, and compare that, for instance. But, because the levels are so low, we don't expect any adverse effects to happen at all in that range, I think. So that's the difficulty, that if you want to do meaningful studies of safety in animals, then you have to use large doses. But if the concentration is low, you cannot do that. So that is the dilemma, shall we say. But I think currently the thinking is that basically chemically there's no difference between the two, and MSC is made by fermentation process, so it's a biological molecule as well as that made by other food systems basically. So I mean, if it was a chemical process, then obviously you might argue that, well, the chemical process is giving off different impurities and so on, perhaps. But as I said, since it's a biological process, we feel that it's equivalent, I think there are those methodological issues as well that's difficult. But as I said, for all intents and purposes, we run many efficacy studies and so on, but we find that they're basically equivalent at those levels. Okay, thank you.
And do you think that we've gone too far down the route of thinking of food as chemicals? John, maybe this is kind of part of the root of why these myths persist, is because we're so obsessed with the components of food rather than the sort of package as a whole.
I think I agree. I think we have also in the way we present dietary advice. So in all countries that have nutritional guidelines, they're broken down into carbohydrates, fat, saturated fat, and protein, and so on. And that's not the way that you look at a meal. You don't look at your plate and think, oh, I've got all this saturated fat in it. So I think there is something to be said for reverting to talking about foods and meals and not emphasizing the individual components, whether it's individual micro components like MSG or macronutrients like carbohydrate, fat and protein. It's just not the way most people think about their food when they sit down to have supper.
No. Another question here.
I wonder if chemistry is getting a bad rap here and whether it could do something. You know, we could actually use the science. So there's a lot of talk about nanotechnology to create different shape to salt molecules. So how salty something is perceived as being is how many receptors are touched by an NaCl molecule. So if you got a molecule that unwrapped itself into a 4-leaf clover, you could quarter the salt and still get the perception. There's talk of the same with sweetness, whether it works or not. Wouldn't that be a good thing? So shouldn't we be careful not to rule out all chemistry? And I wondered if Ajinomoto were doing any work along those lines.
Okay, sorry, I think the mic's on now, so yes. No, we are very interested in technologies to, reduce salt, fat, sugars, and so on, but without reducing the palatability. I think that's the key issue. I mean, you can reduce salt, but if it's not palatable, it doesn't, nobody's going to buy it, and, it's not going to have any effect. So I think in terms of the nanotech, we haven't worked that much with the salt taste. We've been more working on other ingredients that can increase the salt taste, for instance. So, not because, although we do sell salt, but it's not a big part of our business. So at the moment we're shall we say, creating other technologies or ingredients that can enhance the salt taste so that you can reduce the amount of salt, basically.
Yeah, just to respond to that, I'm certainly not advocating reducing our deployment of technology to improve the nutritional and enjoyment qualities of food. I think the nanotechnology case is a very good one. One of the larger food manufacturing companies in this country has developed a low-fat ice cream, exactly as you described, with salt and contact receptors, because ice cream is an emulsion, and the smaller you make the fat globules, the more fatty mouthfeel you get per unit of fat in the product. The difficulty for the manufacturer is how to market this, because coming back to my story about narrative and conspiracy and intrigue, if they simply marketed this as a healthy ice cream and then some campaigning group got hold of the fact it was nanotechnology, or as the Prince of Wales called it, the grey goo, then the company would suffer the same kind of backlash as was experienced in the late 90s over GMOs. So I think there's a hurdle to overcome, and it goes back to the MSG story. How do you present the technology to the public in a way that is they're going to engage with it rather than reject it?
Yes. Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Sure, yes.
Now, all the most precious food ingredients like salt, sugar, and oil are labeled as like villains. It's a terrible thing. It's very confusing to the consumers. Can we turn things around? I'd like to ask Catherine, talking about the redundancy can increase the sensibility, right? The people need high stimulation of high salt, high sugar, high fat. It is because their tongue, the sensitivities become so low that they just become function like rubber rather than a real tongue. But even can we train people? We are training our eyes with art. We are training our ear with the music. But how to train our tongue to appreciate food more, better? Should we treat our food just like animal feed? Or that you have no way to control human being? You just have to have a good formulation. But we can train people. Our tongue basically is still wild, uneducated. Can we do some more work on that? That's good, my question.
Can we help the wild tongue?
Thank you for that question. So the answer is yes. So there's a lot of hope, actually. And we have been starting this also specific to taste, and other researchers have done that very specific to smell, to actually use sensory trainings to improve sensitivity. And one of the major aspects that helps us become more sensitive and more appreciative is a very simple mechanism, and that is paying attention. And that is something we typically do not do with taste and smell. So we are very visual people, so we let us influence by color and packaging and labels, but we are not very much used to paying attention to the inner mouth or to what we actually smell. And a simple thing is to just close your eyes when you smell and taste something, and you will recognize immediately that you get so much better once all this visual distraction is gone. So you can actually train people to pay more attention. And that increases their sensitivity and awareness of what you're actually eating and smelling here.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Can I share one case with you? My lab works a lot on tea. While most people believe that Chinese drink tea a lot, but in fact, only 2 provinces in all of 32 provinces in China, people have experience with tea. So the northern Chinese, they have a very strong taste. They need to eat very salty stuff to feel good. But we train our students, because we are studying tea, it takes a month to get our students to tell the difference between different tea, green tea, black tea, oolong tea. When they can appreciate the difference of tea, we brought them to Fujian province where the food is very plain, like Japanese food. They think, wow, that's the most delicious food in the world. It's like open the whole horizon for them once we train the tongue. Thank you very much.
But I would say anything you eat, you're training. It's how you use the word. We learn to like what we eat. And the bottom line is, if you look at purchasing decisions, taste remains the #1 reason why people buy a food. And so, yes, with experience, with changing the diet, and it takes a while. Just look at the literature on how to try to shift salt preferences. But I would argue that from an early age, you are learning about your food environment and you're liking that which you eat. It's how one uses the word.
But it does sound that education is important, and this is what you have been doing in schools to help children educate. And do you get them to close their eyes while they're tasting food? When you go to the schools and you introduce them to the Japanese food, do you get them to close their eyes to
yes.
focus on the flavor?
Yes. I have to feel 5 senses. Yeah.
Right. So not just in the mouth.
Yes, not only mouth.
And nutrition information is increasing for reasons why people are buying food. But 80-90% remains taste. That is why people buy foods. And so how does one shift is a mystery. That's the difficult one, but that's the reality we're finding ourselves in. Taste matters.
Well, that sounds like a good note to start summing things up on. If I might, I'll just give it a little sort of summary of what we've learned today. It's been a great, great afternoon. There's been it's very, as you said, John, there's very fuzzy evidence. We live in a synthesized world, I think you said, Nick, and Catherine, eating is just an illusion. So we're starting from a place of very little information. But we can build it up. You know, we live in different sensory worlds, and we can build up our taste and our flavour. And as you said, Catherine, as you said, as we age, we might lose our sense of taste. But on the plus side, we might at least increase our free glutamates as we age. And flavour and taste, they're not enough on their own, but they are a good place to start if we put respect into eating and we look for emotional fulfillment. So I think that's what I brought from the afternoon. I'd like to extend my thanks to the staff here at King's Place for putting on a fabulous show, especially to the technical staff for coping with what has been quite bizarre, but it's gone seamlessly. It's great to have Catherine here. I want to thank the nature staff for working tirelessly to put this on, especially Winsome and Ikuko and Naoko, who have been absolutely brilliant behind the scenes. Other people as well, but just focus on you for now. And of course, to our speakers today and to our chef. And I'd like to, can we just have another thank you for all of the speakers? And the one thing I'm sorry we can't have you for, Catherine, is the food and the drink and the reception. But let's all focus on some of the great flavours to be found in the wine. Thank you very much.